And so, ladies and gentlemen, won't you welcome Professor Richard Madsen.
Well, thank you, Clay. I'm always embarrassed by all these things. As a famous law professor once said, after an effusive introduction like that, I hope that the writer of my obituary will be so kind. So thank you very much for that. It's a very great honor to be here, as Rob said. My wife is a teacher all her total career, elementary, then middle school, and later on some adult education. And she always tried to, criticize my teaching to make me a better teacher, with probably not success. But in any case, I owe a lot to the teachers in my life. So today I'll talk about revival of religion in China. As Rob said, there has been a great and really amazing kind of revival of what you might call spiritual life in China. Statistics about these things are hard to come by. Basically, according to some statistics, there are about 300 to 400 million people who belong to some sort of organized religious group in China today. But then some people have done some surveys recently in which they ask people, do they believe in things like spirits and ghosts? Do they practice certain kinds of rituals at funerals or weddings or others? And do they pray when they're in difficulty and so forth and so on? And by that measure, about 85% of the people say they have some sort of faith. Which actually is pretty much similar to what we have in the United States. About 85% of the American population says that they believe in God. A lesser number actually belong to a church and so forth and so on. And so what belief in God means is maybe very vague for some people. But so the number, the percentage of people in China who believe in some sort of non-material, spiritual kind of life is somewhat comparable to the United States. Now, all this is actually confounding to our standard understandings of where the world is supposed to go. Most intellectuals in the West, and for that matter in the East, believe the 21st century would be a secular age, secular century, in which religion would die out. And the frameworks that we use, intellectual frameworks that we use to understand the world, don't take into account the resurgence of various forms of religiosity. I gave a talk a few years ago, actually at the CIA. They asked me to come. I told them I wouldn't talk about any people or anything like that, but just about general religious ideas and theories in China. And I just talked to the analysts, not to the spies. But what they said to me was, it says, now we realize in the world that this religion stuff is important, but most of us, we have our backgrounds are in political science or economics, and we can't wrap our heads around this. So even the CIA, and this causes problems in policy and everything else about dealing with the world. How do you deal with these phenomena that your frameworks and the things you learn don't enable you to take into account? And then I also gave a talk to the Communist Party Committee at the Fudan University, where I was a visiting professor in Shanghai. And I said, your theory from Marx about secularization and so forth really doesn't work at all. And they said, yeah, that's true. We accept that. But the problem is we have this dogma that we have to kind of at least give lip service to it, but we don't really know what to do about this, don't have any guidance for it and so forth. We're kind of dealing with these issues in an ad hoc kind of way. So the Communist Party doesn't know what to do about it. I gave a talk last year actually at the Vatican about this, and the Vatican doesn't know what to do about it either. So nobody knows what to do about it, whether you're religious, secular, political, whether you're American or you're a communist or whatever. So this is something that we need to kind of reflect upon. So a problem in regard to China is that there is a tremendous, rich undergrowth of what you might call spiritual life, practices of all kinds, that don't fit easily into our categories of what religion is. So it's not secular in the sense that we would think about it, but it's not religious exactly in the sense that we would think about it too. So what sense do you make of all this? So here's a few, I'll start out with a couple of slides to kind of illustrate this in history, okay? Oh, this is, I'm sorry. Oh. Oh, it's just, I'm sorry, this is.
No, it's not you.
No. Oh. There you go. Okay. So this first slide this is a little brief history lesson, okay? This is from a park in Shanghai. This little urban park is dedicated to a person named Xu Guangqi. Xu Guangqi was a Ming Dynasty scholar official, lived in the late early 1600s. He was considered the most brilliant scholar of his time. He was the head of what's called the Dueling Academy, which was the main, if you want to call it that, think tank for the Ming Emperor. Later on became the Grand Secretary, equivalent of the Prime Minister to the last Ming Dynasty Emperor. But he got converted to Catholicism by Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci. You can go to the next slide. Will this work now? Okay, good. Here's a picture, statues of the two of them there. Ricci was a Jesuit who came to China about 1580. Around 1600, he met Xu Guangqi, and he converted him to Catholicism. So Ricci was these early Jesuits were tremendous pioneers. This park was actually helped to be rebuilt by the Jesuits here at USF here in San Francisco. They initiated a tremendous cross-cultural encounter that resonates to this day. Ricci was really adept in all the cutting-edge science of his time, and he mastered Chinese. And he and Xu Guangqi translated together Euclid's geometry, principles of geometry, into Chinese. And to this day, the words for line and point and angle are still the words that they used in their translation. He also created a map of the world, which showed the world was round. China wasn't exactly the center of the world, and that was very kind of unsettling for people in China. At the other hand, they translated the 4 classic books of Confucius, of the Confucian canon, into Latin, the first time these books had been translated into a Western language. So it was a great kind of meeting of the minds. So Xu Guangqi was converted to Catholicism, and the approach that these Jesuits had was, and this has to do with what religion in China was, that there were all these rituals that people practiced, all these forms that would look like worship. And the Jesuits said, this wasn't religion, okay? What was it? It was good morality. So the people like Xu Guangqi, they venerated their ancestors and all these rituals. And the Jesuits said, well, that just shows they have good morality, honor thy father and thy mother. It's good practice. It's not religion. And so therefore, they don't have to give any of that stuff up to become a Catholic, okay? So Xu Guangqi did have to give something up, but like all officials of his time, he had several concubines and so forth with his wife, and he had to give those up. But the rituals for his ancestors didn't have to give up. And so that was the Jesuit approach to this. But part of it was an issue, what is this, these practices the Chinese do? Is this religion or is it not? Is it morality? What is it? And there's this ambiguity. So Today, this is the church right next to that park. It's in the area in Shanghai called Xujiahui, which means a Xu family gathering place. The Xu family gave it to the Jesuits, this big plot of land, which is now in the most upscale part of Shanghai. And this is in about 1900, the Jesuits built this church in this European style. And you see that at the Sunday Mass, it's basically packed. And so, so this was a legacy of this kind of encounter. However, there was a problem back in the 1600s, early 1700s, and the Jesuits had rivals. The Jesuits had the religious order of the Dominicans and the Franciscans. They didn't like each other at all. And the Dominicans and Franciscans said the Jesuits, they have it all wrong about these Chinese practices. This is not. The Jesuits say this is not religion, this is just good morality, it's a good practice, they can totally compatible with the Catholic faith. Dominicans say all this stuff that people are doing, this is religion, false religion, and they got to stop it. If they want to be a Catholic, they have to give all that stuff up. So there was a bitter controversy, and in early 1700s, the Pope, this is a stained glass windows in this church, the Pope came down on the side of the rivals to the Jesuits, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, which eventually forced the Jesuits to have to be disbanded for a century. Okay, it was a bitter thing. So the Pope came down the other side. You had to give all this stuff up if you're going to be a Catholic. But part of it, the issue was that what is this stuff that the Chinese are doing? And how do you define it, and how do you describe it? There's ambiguity, and the ambiguity and the difficulties of understanding and reconciling this led to bitter, terrible controversy, which had great effect on Western society as well as China itself, and of course, a big problem with Western Catholicism. This is a church in city of Xiamen, which was a Dominican church, okay, run by the rivals of the Jesuits. And this church is still, though, active and full. So, now a real brief history lesson. Come to the 20th century. The Chinese developed words for religion, which actually come from the West. The word that they use for religion, Zongjiao, is not an ancient Chinese word. It was coined in the 19th century to translate words about religion from German. And basically, understanding religion is an organized, group with organized systematic doctrines and priests, professionals who lead it and so forth. And that's what a religion is. It's a vision of religion is in the image of what religion is in the West, Western Christianity, Western Protestantism, and so forth. And then the communists, in their way of handling China, they believe, by good Marxist understanding, that religion was on the way out, that once you got rid of class exploitation, people wouldn't need religion to be kind of an opiate of the people, to kind of deaden the pain that comes from exploitation. Once you got rid of this exploitation, religion would go away, be no problem. But in the meantime, following Lenin and Stalin, you had to control religion, and you had to control it by taking care of the top leaders of this religion and encasing them in a rigid structure that was controlled by the Communist Party. This whole set of practices came from Lenin and then perfected by Stalin. And if you remember the Communist Club, you had to basically follow those practices whether they fit your country or not. The problem was that these ways of handling religion were based on the Russian communist experience with the Russian Orthodox Church, very organized, hierarchical church, and the Bolsheviks felt that they had to control that church by basically throwing their top leaders into prison and then replacing them with people who were, close followers of communism, and then sort of strangling the religion that way. And so it worked with that. But the problem was they did go after organized religions like the Catholic Church that way. They arrested leading bishops and put them in jail, executed some priests and so forth, and then try to control the whole thing by constructing this sort of what they call a patriotic association that controlled the life of the church in a very kind of circumscribed way. Did the same thing for Protestants, same thing for Muslims, same thing for the Buddhists, and so forth. But that only really captured a kind of tiny fraction of what you could call the people's spiritual life, because the real spiritual life went beyond these categories, weren't really encompassed by that. The real spiritual life of people was embedded in local community, local ways of living. You didn't really have organized priests. You didn't have an organized, professional clergy or anything like that. What you had was families basically worshiping their ancestors, other kinds of people embedded in communities, doing kind of things that were part of community life, but also had what you could call a spiritual dimension to them. So here's a few slides that show you forms in which some of this kind of non-religious religion is how it's blossoming forth in China today. So this is from a village in northern China in Hebei province. It's a kind of a blighted area. There are a lot of basically iron mines and coal mines here, and it's very dry, and agriculture is not very good, and people are actually pretty poor. But this place was a so-called revolutionary base area for the communists during the war against Japan. And they have a museum there to Communist Party martyrs who died fighting the Japanese during World War II. But no one goes to the museum anymore. But this tablet here tries to commemorate this revolutionary history. But what's more important are those new tablets, these black tablets that were just recently installed. What these tablets is they tell you how the people in this village have a common ancestor. Everyone in this village, 6,000 people in there, they're all surnamed Lin. And they all claim that they're direct descendants of someone named Lin Xiangru, who lived 2,300 years ago, a famous figure in Chinese history that elementary school students in China all read about Lin Xiangru. And they're all these are all his descendants. He's a great ancestor. And so Lin Xiangru, what they have now here is this structure was supposed to be a museum to Lin Xiangru. And they're also hoping to bring in the tourist trade because, as I said, people all read about Lin Xiangru. Who was he? He was an official in the so-called Warring States period, where these small states were all fighting each other and fighting especially against the encroaching state of the Qin state, that then was later crushed by the Emperor Qin, and then that created unified China. Lin Xiangru was basically a Confucian, representing Confucian morality. And he was someone who basically believed in winning people over by courtesy and persuasion and looking for peace. And he was trying to organize the warring states to help fight against Emperor Qin, who was a brutal follower of realpolitik, and based on what they call the legalist philosophy in China, kind of raw power. And in Chinese history, this kind of conflict between this Confucian conscience and the tradition of using raw power to control people goes all the way down through Chinese history. And all governments, including the one today, that says we believe in the Confucian way, but then in practice, including Xi Jinping, I think believes in the Emperor Qin's method, okay? But this is the kind of the dialectic that goes on in China today. So anyway, so this is in honor of Lin Xiangru, and back of it, there's a mound like you saw for Xu Guangqi, was supposed to be probably the tomb of Lin Xiangru, who lived 2,300 years ago. Now, I don't know whether it's a tomb or not. I wouldn't want to do DNA analysis on whatever is in there, but they say this is where he was buried. So then they're hoping to bring in tourism, and they have this museum, and the museum, here's a statue there in the middle of the museum, Lin Xiangru. And you see, though, they're burning his incense and so forth in front of him. And this is supposed to be a museum, but doesn't look like exactly a museum. This is a picture of a famous incident in which Lin Xiangru won over his rival by courtesy and persuasion, and that was his proper method. But in the back of this museum, supposedly museum, and that for tourism, there's this device, and what this device is planchette, which is basically a device used to communicate with the spirits of the dead. And this is a traditional aspect of Chinese religion. People go into it's kind of like a seance, a kind of a trance, and the spirit communicates with you, and you use this device, and your hand shakes, and it makes Chinese characters on a bed of sand, and then you interpret the characters, and this is what the spirit is telling you. So this is a museum, supposedly, from the government's point of view, but then from the people's point of view, this is Lin Chengru is alive and well, and communicating through this device. So what you see in China today, a lot of these practices, which the government officially would constitute a superstition and say we're getting rid of, are still alive and well, but also the government wouldn't admit it. So this is a tourist thing. It's actually part of what a new category in China called intangible cultural heritage. This is a UNESCO designation. And so this is intangible cultural heritage, mostly secular, bringing tourism. So that's the government's view of what's going on. Then the people's view is, this communication with the spirits of the dead, and so forth and so on. So that's just one example. There's another example. This is nearby this village in the same area. And this is a less official kind of thing. But this is a temple complex, actually. There are 24 kind of pavilions in this temple going up the side of this hill, which is built in honor of this healing woman. This woman came to this village in 1950, married into it, and she discovered, or people thought she had, special healing powers. She lays hands on people and she heals them. And this wouldn't be, broadcast in the Chinese People's Daily newspaper. By word of mouth around the world, she became famous throughout China, and even as far as Australia. She had a woman come visit her from Australia who heard about her, and woman had some malady, and the healing woman heals them. And this is a picture of her. She's 83 years old now, and people really believe that this works. I don't know, if it's psychosomatic or whatever, but people really think that they've been healed by her. And then when people are healed, they're grateful, and so they donate money to build temples to these various deities. So these are a kind of traditional kind of Chinese deities who were at one time people who then become, they're sort of like saints, deified. This one here is interesting. This is called the Unborn Eternal Mother, Wushang Laomu. And this was a woman who, during Chinese imperial age, people carried out massive rebellions, believing that she was coming back to Earth in kind of, an apocalyptic way and righting all the wrongs. So they have a pavilion for her. The new one, they said it was built, I didn't see the new one, someone who had problems with his eyesight, felt that he was healed, and there's a pavilion to a goddess who was supposed to heal people's eyes. And so they keep building these things up the side of this hill. And the government sort of turns a blind eye to it, because the woman, what they've actually done is, there's been a problem of deforestation in the area, and they've kind of reforested the area. So it's not officially classified as a temple. It's classified as an ecological reforestation area, okay? So once again, you have this sense the government doesn't know what to make of this stuff. So they can't say they're building a temple. They're saying they're building a museum. They're saying they're building a reforestation area and so forth. But meantime, all these people are believing that this woman is healing them with special powers, and there's these gods that are helping you, and you're going to worship them in these pavilions. And like you said, it's a very extensive complex. Tens of thousands of people show up at certain main festival times to take part in this. So now this is another example, but in a different area. This is in the area, southern China, near the city of Wenzhou, which is in southern China. What this is is an ancestor temple. It's an incredible thing. It looks like a Tiananmen, and they have these stone lions. And this temple built by a man named Mr. Chen, who was the, some people say the whole author of what's called a Wenzhou economic miracle. And he helped revive the whole economy of Wenzhou to make it one of the most dynamic commercial economies in the whole of China in the 1980s. They started out making buttons actually for shirts, and most of the buttons on your shirts and blouses probably still come from them. Each button costs a penny or so, but there's a lot of buttons, a lot of shirts in the world. It adds up, and they've made a lot of money. And Mr. Chen has made a lot of money. And so one way he's celebrating this is build a temple to his ancestors. So he built, look at this temple. And inside, there's actually badminton courts in the middle, and there are meeting rooms. And this officially, on top of it, it said this is a community center, okay? This is a community center, which actually what these temples were in the old days. They were community centers. But it's actually it's a temple to here's the badminton courts. It's a huge thing, okay? And this is an altar to his ancestor who would have lived about 400 and 500 years ago, the Chen ancestor to this village. And underneath, you see there's kind of this crypt. And these are tablets to all the ancestors of the Chen family. And they burn incense to them. And the belief was that these ancestors actually live in these tablets, okay? And they're there, and you pray to them. And the Chinese New Year celebration on the Chinese New Year's Eve is the most solemn part of the whole celebration. You have this family meal, you sit around a round table. And one belief is these ancestors then leave their tablets and they come into your house and they sit at the table with you. Your whole family is there together, all the generations and so forth, past and the present, and hope for the future, and they're all there. So this is this thing, and this is Mr. Chen's temple. This is a picture of the ancestor. This Mr. Chen, you see, he's a philanthropist, and just like the old gentry of old, and he's built this very progressive school in the middle of the city. Really, absolutely first-rate facilities and first-rate kind of modern education, et cetera. Anyway, so once again, you see the revival of kind of old kind of roles, and based on things like ancestor worship and so forth. Now, this is another temple in the area, different kind of temple. And this is basically based on kind of Taoist beliefs. This, too, is a kind of World Heritage Site, because it's a very old temple with very rich history. You see these deities there, and people have these kind of like lights, they're like burning candles to the deities. This is a Taoist priest who does rituals and so forth, who's based there. This is this tablet is the names of all the people who donated to the temple, because that's what you do. You donate money to build the temple, and you get recognized that way. But the temple is one of the main deities there is a dragon boat god, and that's a dragon boat. And the big one on the top is the mother boat. It's not the one they race. And then the smaller ones are the ones they actually race. And the Dragon Boat Festival, all the villages in the community, they race these boats together sometimes. But they bring the boats on a canal to this temple before the thing, and they have kind of sacrifices and rituals to kind of bless the whole event. And they also work out rules of engagement. So one rule is, for example, that if you're winning in the race, and you shouldn't try to pull ahead. So you should not try to win by more than 3 seat lengths in the boat, because if you really moved out ahead and beat them badly, they would lose face, you've got to fight, and so forth. And people actually, in the old days, there were vicious fights, people drowned and so forth. And so they try to keep it under control. And now the Dragon Boats thing is on the TV, it's a big cultural festival and so forth. But there's this kind of religious dimension to the whole thing, okay? Now, this is another register. This is actually a Christian church. This is a Protestant church. This particular church is under the control of what's called the Three Self-Protestant movement, patriotic Protestant church that controls who becomes a minister and so forth and so on. But it's pretty popular. On the other hand, there are many, many Protestants, more than belong to these kind of churches, maybe 60 million Protestants of various kinds, basically evangelical Protestants who worship in their own churches and they in their own buildings and so forth. They're not approved by the government. So part of the issue is that the government allows religion under these strict kind of frameworks, but then it breaks the boundaries of all this, and people are doing all sorts of things that are not permitted, and it keeps growing, and the government thought it would all go away, and they don't know what to do about it, and so forth. So, but this one is official. This is an altar in the church. You see a lot of the pews. It's very nice setup. This here is building's a Catholic seminary in Shijiazhuang in northern China. That's to train young priests. It's under the auspices of the government, sort of, but they had like a big student strike demonstration a few years ago because the government tried to put in a rector to the seminary who the students thought was really a non-believer and, you know, and so forth, and they wouldn't accept him, and there was a standoff, et cetera. So you see these kind of tensions. This is a kind of a side street chapel for the Catholic Church in that area. This is another one. Now this woman there, this shows you how, although this is sort of under the control of the official government, there's all sorts of gray areas in which people are carrying out various things that the government wouldn't like in the name of religion. So that one woman there, sitting there, is actually a Catholic nun, a member of religious order. And the other woman there, whose face is hand over her face, is a woman from a village, a villager. And the woman from the village has HIV/AIDS. And she comes from a village in which all the women in the village went to the local hospital to give birth to their babies. And the hospital gave them all blood transfusions. And the blood transfusions were tainted with HIV. And they all have AIDS. And all the women have AIDS, their husbands have AIDS, their children have AIDS. The whole thing is a mess. And so the nuns set up a center in the village to try to help these women, to get them some AIDS medicine, but also to do things like they're not necessarily Catholics, these women, but the nuns are trying to help them, give them some psychological counseling, spiritual counseling, give them some economic help. Because they have the HIV, they don't have a lot of strength, and so they try to give them economic things to do that aren't so strenuous. They have them raising goats. Goats are easy to raise. They run around the mountain and so forth. You don't have to spend a lot of effort, and so that helps them. But the local government decided that it's a tremendous loss of face that they messed up so badly with this. They don't want anyone to know about it, don't want anything done about it, so they kicked the nuns out and closed the center down. And so the picture I took was in a more distant area where these women from the village had to take a bus to come. And the nuns still want to carry out this work in the name of Christian charity and so forth, and to help them, et cetera. And so they're doing that. It's not exactly legal because the local regulations say they shouldn't be doing it, but they're doing it anyway. And they're under the official church, but they're sort of doing things that are not official because their sense of what religion is goes beyond, you know, what the government framework, okay? Now this house, this is a so-called underground Catholic church, okay? Underground is actually above ground, you see. It's not actually hidden exactly, but in the courtyard next to it, you see the empty space. There actually was a church there. They built a church, unregistered, unofficially approved. And they said it was a very nice church. The government came and tore it down, bulldozed it. And the people there, when I talk about this, are extremely upset about this whole thing, as you can imagine, right? But all the people in that village are Catholics. They had this church, it wasn't approved, got torn down. But what they've done is, here's a sign says, "Long live the Pope." And so they show their devotion to the Pope, not supposed to. But they've taken several farmhouses and they kind of hollowed them out, and they made a church inside these houses, not official. And here is a picture of the priests that served this thing, even though it's kind of non-official, it's unofficial, unregistered, illegal in some ways. So you see these different kinds of religion in China kind of breaking the boundaries of what this government calls religion, breaking the boundaries of the organizations that it's set up to control it. And then maybe just a couple final things to show other ways religion develops. This is from Taiwan. There you have a new kind of rebirth of various forms of Buddhism, now purified, pulled away from the community, but brought to a different level. This is the headquarters of a group called Tzu, which they have branches here in California. And that nun there in the middle, Master Zhengyan, is the head of it, and it has about 100 nuns that live in that building I showed you. But they have about 4 million followers, and they have about 100,000 of these commissioners who are especially devoted lay people. And the women, they wear these navy blue uniforms and so forth, and the master is giving them kind of an award. And this is me and my wife, and this is Master Zhengyan. That woman is, one of the women is going to be like a Buddhist nun, but more like a Catholic nun, that she's not going to shave her head and wear these robes, but kind of work in the world. So she, and what they do is they try to develop Buddhism so it both conforms to the modern world, but helps raise the world up. So, for example, one thing you're not supposed to do in Buddhism is kill any living thing. So in the temple, in the monastery, you're not even supposed to kill a mosquito or an ant. But I asked them about their medical school, and they said, "Do you do animal experimentation and so forth?" And they said, "Yes, this is scientific medicine. We do research and so forth, and sometimes you have to do experimentation on animals. You have to kill the animals sometimes." The master says, as long as it's done in the humane way and not cause undue suffering, but you're helping people, can do that. So that's watering down Buddhism. But they also try to lift up the world. So they do different things to innovate Taiwan society. So this actually is, they've innovated hospice care. And this is actually a room in the hospice which people are brought literally in their last hours. And what they do is, there's a big bed there, the family can gather around and so forth, and they have 2 cabinets. And so, see, one is a picture of the Buddha, one is a Christian thing. So the person's a Christian, they open up the Christian one and so forth, I think. The person's a Buddhist, they open the Buddhist one. It's good, so they don't care what religion you are, but the idea is to provide this kind of compassionate care at the end of life. And this here is a room in the, where they do anatomy classes, gross anatomy, and they have a way of doing it. This is a class where doctors in training learn how to dissect, human cadaver, right? And they have a whole way in with bringing the cadaver in, and they treat it as what they call a silent teacher, and have all these rituals and so forth. And then on the wall there, they have a picture of the person that they're working on and what their family was like and so forth and so on. And they're supposed to treat the person as, so doing surgery, it's not just like doing plumbing or something. This is a person you're dealing with, et cetera, et cetera. And they try to develop that spirit. And then when they finish with the cadaver, the body is cremated, the family comes, and they give half the ashes back to the family, and they keep half of them in this little chapel next to the room where they do the dissection. And they before they do it, they come and they pray to the spirits of the people who donated their bodies and so forth. They're kept in little urns there and so forth. So it's a way of kind of humanizing the process of medicine, even as they've kind of watered down a little bit of a Buddhist thing. So that's it. And here he'd be giving a talk to the Buddhist nuns there. You see they sit on the floor when you talk like this. And so I've been trying in some of my work to sort of, be a bridge builder in East and West and try to understand what they're doing and understand their spiritual quest, but also kind of talk to them and reflect upon it. So that's it for now. Thank you very much.
Thank
thank you. Let's keep you here. Thank you for a wonderful talk. And by the way, this is how you'll need to sit next year at the workshop. And if we're lucky, of course, we'd have Professor Madsen back. And so you've demonstrated this revival and all sorts of different religious beliefs. Ones that we may recognize, ones may be a little bit new to some of us. What's driving this revival? That's the first question. And then the second question is, like Tzu Chi it has this elaborate social welfare system, hospitals, education, all those sorts of things. But they're on the mainland. You can find Tzu Chi on the mainland. What kinds of needs are being met? You've highlighted some education, but also spiritual. What sorts of things are happening? So what's driving it, and what is sort of the public benefit, and how the government responds to that?
So I think what's driving it are multiple things, and there are multiple kinds of these phenomena, right? And driven by multiple kinds of motivations, right? There are some people, perhaps urban people, who are, worried about the material life is not good enough for them, and they feel they need to understand something higher. They need to kind of pull their lives together. So, for example, there's an author, Meow Meow. She's a Shanghainese author who wrote these books, kind of scandalous, about a lot of sex and drugs and so forth in the books. Okay, so her Meow Meow, someone told me, is her life was becoming a little bit too much like the characters in her book. Okay, and sort of spinning out of control. So now Meow Meow had become a Buddhist, right? And kind of straightened her life out. Some of these business people too, it's another big thing. They eat and they go to these banquets, they drink and they see prostitutes and all that, and to do their business deals. And now they're coming to think that it's ruining their health, ruining the liver. They're getting STDs. So now they got to cleanse themselves, and they go to Buddhism and so forth to kind of get their life turned around. So that's one. Other things, in the countryside, there is a way of kind of understanding kind of their traditional communities and to, find meaning and solidarity within the community itself. And that's not quite the same thing as these urbanites, right? And then there's this competition. So I show you the picture of the ancestor hall of Mr. Chen. I was once with a bunch of his other friends, all these big business people from the area, and they're all building these halls, and they're all a little bragging at each other. My hall is bigger than yours, right, and so forth. So there's that kind of status thing connected in this traditional way. And then there are people who families, let's say they're Christians who are Catholics, that's often transmitted from parent to child, and so they want to revive memory of their families and go back. People then also take part in these religious events with different understanding of what it all means. I think the main thing that's important is the practice, not the belief. So you'll see people going to honor the dead, for instance, and during the Qingming festival, the Day of the Dead in April. And the whole family will be together. And there are some people who actually believe that these spirits of the dead are there in this tomb, and you're really sacrificing all this kind of thing. And there are others who probably come, maybe younger generation, who think, well, I don't believe in this, but I want to honor my ancestors, but I want to do the same thing. People do the same rituals, but they have different meaning, understanding what they're doing. And so I think in China, it's always been that way, actually. Religion is more a matter of practice than actual belief and doctrines. The doctrines are very flexible and very, very open. So that's what's going on. In Taiwan, one thing interesting, the new middle classes feel, though they do need religion that's more pure, so that's what the Tzu Chi is trying to do, to kind of develop it away from these folk practices and say you really got to commit yourself to helping others. What they want to do is to help make the world a better place and so forth and so on. And you need this kind of motivation, right, to give meaning to these new middle classes where rural people have a different understanding of what they're doing. So anyway, so it's very mixed, but you get a lot of these phenomenon of all kinds.
Yeah, and so we've talked a little bit about Confucius, and Confucius emphasized the ritual, so that you drag your kids to these rituals so that they see you observing, they then hopefully get something out of that. We've got about 5 minutes for your questions. Please, here in the middle.
One of the real challenges that China faces, and subsequently the world as well, is how to protect the environment. And all of the Chinese religious traditions have ideas about protecting the environment. Certainly Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism, I guess to a lesser extent. Christianity also. But I'm wondering if you've seen evidence that people are turning to religion as a motivation for protecting the environment, and whether, or even if the government is saying, well, we should protect the environment because of, it's part of our tradition.
I think, as you say, these religions have ways of looking at the world that would call forth the balance, ecological balance. Buddhism is a good example. In the past, they didn't necessarily do that much to help the environment. But now some of them are calling upon this and maybe looking at the signs of the times and being very energetic about it. So one of my graduate students actually studying in Taiwan, for example, that Tzu Chi is a good example. They've made environmental protection a kind of a major part of their mission. And that has probably helped the environmental consciousness in Taiwan. Tzu Chi runs these big recycling efforts. They get their volunteers out, picking up plastic trash and so forth. They recycle it, they make blankets out of it and bottles and so forth and so on. And that has helped kind of raise environmental consciousness in Taiwan. It's probably come from other circles in the society as well. So Taiwan, about a generation ago, was 75th in the world in terms of contributing to pollution or something like that. Now it's gone up. Now it's only about 25th or so. It's been actually quite a big improvement for a developing country. So, and I think the religious groups in places like Taiwan have actually helped with that, okay? In China, the government is more of a top-down thing, and so whether they want to bring the religious people in for that is, I don't know. But in Taiwan, they have marvelous recycling programs now. They have these trucks that come around every day, pick up, your plastic and all that, and they have music they play. It's even in popular culture. There are pop songs, like there's a song about breakup that I want to recycle the garbage from my heart and so forth, this kind of thing, right? So, but there's a kind of recycling consciousness in Taiwan, which is actually quite impressive, okay?
The efforts in Taiwan on the environmental front are really quite striking. One of the most polluted to one of the better. We have a question over here.
Thank you. So Falun Gong was a grassroots movement that scared the heck of the government 15, 20 years ago. Two questions. First one, what is the status of Falun Gong? Is it something the Chinese government even, we see them in Chinatown, we see them all over the place. Is Chinese government even paying attention to them because they have somewhat diminished? The other question is, what is the Chinese government doing in terms of stopping the next potential Falun Gong movement? Are they having their eyes and their ears out in the village communities to make sure that's not going to happen again?
Well, okay, so Falun Gong was this spiritual movement that then flourished in the 1990s. And then they carried out a big demonstration in front of the leadership compound in Tiananmen Square in 1999, and then the government sort of panicked and has gone all out to crush them in sometimes very brutal ways. So it's been suppressed in China. one problem with Falun Gong is, one issue is kind of relates to what I was saying, is it was hard to tell whether it's a religion or not. Falun Gong actually was initially registered in China as physical education, physical education. So you do these exercises and you channel this qi, that's part of your energy, okay? And so one level looks like, physical ed. Another level, it's religion. And so what was it? And then the religious aspect came out more to the fore in the late 90s. And then the government got very afraid of its mobilization capacity. And right now in China itself, it's suppressed. It probably exists in a semi-underground thing. Some of the people who practiced it were actually quite, sophisticated technologically. A thing they did some years ago actually was, for instance, they took over one of the broadcasting satellites in China, and your regular programs went out, and they spent for an hour, you get Falun Gong propaganda on it. So this is, these people, to know how to hijack a satellite, and take over the radio channel and so forth, you have to know something about electrical engineering to do that, right? So this is not, most of us couldn't do that, right? Silicon Valley, maybe you know how to do it, but Falun Gong knows how to do it. And so they're still there, but then they've also gone global, and there are, they have websites and activities around the world. In Taiwan, there are about 1 million Falun Gong followers, and in Taiwan they have religious freedom, and so there are 1 million people believe in Falun Gong, and other people may think it's weird and so forth and so on, and might believe it, but it doesn't, threaten the foundations of the Taiwan government, right? People believe things, and maybe it's weird, but it doesn't, the society goes on. But in China, they're very afraid of anything that doesn't fit their categories. They don't understand, so they're kind of crushing it. I think maybe it's kind of like, they get a counter reaction. It's counterproductive, but that's what they're doing. So, and what they're going to do is they're increasing surveillance of all kinds in China. So they're surveillance to try to stop everything. But I think what happens is, and Falun Gong, a good example, when you can't define things clearly, and you don't know what you're doing, you get blindsided. Things come out of nowhere that you could never participate. So I think we're going to be lots of surprises, even though they try to keep everything under control.
Yeah, so Falun Gong definitely didn't fit into the 5 authorized religions or the hierarchies, and challenged it, and subsequently was suppressed. Ladies and gentlemen, I've certainly learned a lot. I hope that you have, and I hope that you've got some ideas about integrating some of this into your classes. Let's thank Professor Madsen.